We're surrounded by stuff. Kitchen stuff, office stuff, useful stuff, useless stuff, single-use stuff, never-use stuff, environmentally toxic stuff, marginally less toxic stuff. We buy and buy and buy. It's the foundation of how our economies run and how they grow. But all this buying, all this economic growing, is devastating people and our planet. From fast fashion to flights, smartphones to skincare, today our consumer-based societies are gobbling up the planet's resources at a rate that's 1.75 times faster than it can regenerate. How do we know? Well, there's an international NGO called the Global Footprint Network, who for many years have been tracking something called Earth Overshoot Day. It's the date in the annual calendar when, according to available data, more of the Earth's ecological resources have been used than can naturally be replenished in a year. In 2021, Earth Overshoot Day was on July 29th. This year, in 2022, it landed a day earlier on July 28th. This follows a 30-year trend that has steadily pushed overshoot days earlier and earlier. There are variations though, depending on where you live. For instance, if all of humanity consumed resources like Qatar, a small nation in the Middle East, Earth Overshoot Day would be as early as February 10th. After all, they are a major global provider and consumer of fossil fuels like natural gas. On the other end of the spectrum, a country of roughly the same size and population, Jamaica, currently consumes in a way that would make Earth's resources last all the way until late December. Meanwhile, the UK's Overshoot Day in 2022 fell on May 19th, Japan May 6th, Norway April 12th, Australia March 23rd, while in the US and Canada it was even earlier still, on the 13th of March. Once you've heard all these dates, it's easy to think consumers, especially those of us in the global north, we're the problem.
There are people who think it's all just about consumers, and if consumers could just change, we could stop the climate crisis, and I think that's not the right way to look at it.
I spoke with Dr. Juliet Shaw, an economic sociologist at Boston College, who has spent more than 30 years studying consumers and consumption habits.
It's much more that production drives the system, and although consumers are a key part of it and they have to play their part to keep the system going, the sort of power in the system is located much more on the production side.
It's not really about consumer culture as such. It's really more about the underlying economic system that we live in and that governs our lives, right? Which is, of course, capitalism.
Dr. Jason Hickel is an economic anthropologist whose work centres on questions relating to ecological economics and global inequality.
Now, under capitalism, the object of constantly increasing production is not to meet any specific concrete human or social need. So you have the system that produces an extraordinary amount of output. It's profoundly productive. And in order to keep this constantly going, then you have to somehow have people absorb all of that output, right? So the consequence of this is that people are effectively forced to become consumers.
Over the course of the 20th century, capitalism established itself as the economic system across most of the world. And central to the capitalist model is the idea that people are, first and foremost, independent consumers. It was the end of World War II that triggered an extraordinary spurt in consumerism in the West. Rebuilding war-torn nations and societies resulted in an employment bonanza, and as more money flowed, goods became cheaper and more abundant. The consumerist genie had been let out of the bottle. In decades to come, environmentalists would look back at the late 1940s and call it the Great Acceleration, a period in which human impact on the planet increased exponentially.
In the post-World War II period, there was a big move in the West, in the global North countries, to depoliticize consumption.
No industry can prosper long without the consent of the consumer.
To sort of mark it off as a sphere that should not be subject to social concerns and citizenship concerns, that what you consume is a private matter, rather than a public matter. And it's a way of stabilizing the economy and providing more employment, to increase consumption, to maintain consumer demand, and so forth.
For businesses and corporations, keeping the consumerist engine running is vital for their existence. So there are numerous tricks of the trade to keep people buying. One of them is something called planned obsolescence. It's a complex name that basically means deliberate poor design.
The idea here is that you want to design products to break down after a relatively short period of time, make them very difficult to repair so that people have no other alternative but to replace them quite frequently. A huge number of tech firms use this strategy. We know that white goods like refrigerators and washing machines, dishwashers and so on have increasingly short lifespans. They could last much, much longer with very little additional cost to make them more robust. But basically, companies are incentivized to ensure that they break down in a short period of time.
Obsolescence of the operational kind is one thing, but what about perceived obsolescence, when the product is still working but has become obsolete in your eyes? This happens so often and so insidiously that you probably don't even know which kitchen gadget, phone case or pair of sneakers you bought because you really needed to replace something, or because you were persuaded into thinking you needed something new even though what you already had was just fine. Advertisers have perfected strategies to keep us buying by exploiting our emotions, our fear of not fitting in, or our desire to be more attractive.
Lift your beauty to new heights with new revitalizing Supreme Plus Youth Power Cream.
Be the man of today. Boss Bottle.
This kind of advertising is not telling you what the company's products are, but instead what you could be with their product.
So if they want to call you crazy, fine. Show them what crazy can do.
However, in Juliet's view, an even more powerful influence than traditional marketers are our neighbours, co-workers, or the people we follow online.
In today's video, I'm going to show you everything I bought from Primark on my most recent spree.
When you see other people who got a new phone that has a better camera, it's bigger, it does all these things that your phone doesn't do, even if it's still working, people are going to want that new one. So there's a sort of performance and social obsolescence. It's less that the thing is going to just break down, which is the old idea of planned obsolescence. It's a much more sophisticated version of it today.
The point of building obsolescence into products is to create demand, something that justifies continuous buying. In the sphere of luxury goods, though, generating demand isn't enough. So-called exclusive brands have to be able to justify steep prices, so a sense of scarcity is needed. In 2018, high-end brand Burberry incinerated $35 million of unsold clothes precisely to manufacture that shortage of goods. What's remarkable about the transformation of humanity into a giant mass of insatiable consumers is how even fundamental needs have been sucked into the market system, meaning we're competing with each other to buy the things we need for a decent life.
So things like healthcare and public transportation and housing, these are core human need satisfiers. And there's a need in a growth-oriented system to ensure that needs are not satisfied as much as possible. And one of the ways that you do that is by privatizing these core goods. So as the cost of housing and medicine and healthcare increases, then we're under compulsion to work and produce more than we otherwise might need to in order to satisfy those basic needs. As long as the goal is growthism, then the objective quite often is to avoid meeting human needs or even sabotaging people's capacity to meet their human needs.
If you have the money, then being a consumer has never been easier. With a click, swipe, tap, our things appear before us. Products are cheaper than ever, even the ones that have to travel across the world to get to us. And the more we're able to buy, the less we know how our stuff gets made, what goes into it, what it demands of those who make it, and what impact this manufacturing has.
People have no idea about the story of the products they consume.
This is Dr. Ndongo Sila, a development economist in Senegal.
For example, you have, let's say, a dress. You don't know under which conditions that dress has been produced. Maybe it has been in Bangladesh with people working, let's say, 20 hours out of 24,
If we just pay attention to the products that are all around us, the clothes that we wear, our tech gadgets, where do those resources come from? Where do the impacts of that extraction happen? They're not happening in southern England. They're not happening in Finland. The majority of that impact is happening at the resource frontiers. In the Congo, for example, or in Indonesia, or in Brazil. So we don't have to deal in rich countries with the social and ecological costs of growth because they're offshore, right? And it just so happens that they're externalized not to space or into nothingness, but rather they're externalized onto the lives and ecosystems of communities in the Global South.
Jason is an authority on how and why the Global South suffers so much of the impact of out-of-control consumerism that is centred in the affluent North. There's no real way to narrate this as a short story. The factors at play are numerous. There's history, for example, the long legacy of colonial empires. There's the battle of politics and ideologies, capitalism versus communism, Western democracies orchestrating very undemocratic coups elsewhere. There's economics, and especially the rise of neoliberalism, which is an academic term to describe an accelerated form of capitalism, where the cost of wages and commodities are suppressed through monopolised international trade rules, and almost everything is privatised.
The result has been inequalities that are so baked into how global systems operate that it becomes inevitable that the South services the North and pays a huge price for it.
Much of that economic capacity in the Global South is actually organized around servicing Global North consumerism and capital accumulation rather than meeting domestic human needs. You know, the factories and the lands in the Global South and the resources. These things are not being mobilized around housing and nutritious food and healthcare and education for the domestic population. Rather, they're organized around fast fashion and tech gadgets, which are shipped to the Global North.
But for those goods to be consumed by the average people in the Global North, the goods in the Global South have been produced with lower and lower costs. That means that the producers have to be paid very low wages. And that means that the prosperity in the Global North is somehow dependent on maintaining workers in the Global South in the permanent state of deprivation.
So as long as the Global South is put in a position where they're dependent on the whims of foreign direct investors, then what they'll do is they'll compete with each other in order to cut wages and cut environmental protections and cut taxes and so on to create a so-called attractive business environment for multinational firms.
The inequalities in global economic development have a parasitic relationship between the North and South at their core. One theory is of unequal exchange. It lays out how growth in so-called advanced economies often relies on a large net appropriation of resources and human labour from the Global South at prices that are unjustifiably low, even if they are supposedly explained through market-based systems. According to Jason and his colleagues, today the Global North drains the South of commodities worth $2.2 trillion per year when calculated in northern prices. Yes, money does flow the other way, but they calculated that for every dollar of aid the Global South receives, they lose $30 through unequal exchange with the North. In effect, poor countries are developing rich countries, not the other way round.
There is always this idea that countries in the Global South lack money, but in fact, the aid or foreign investment, the external flows coming from the Global North, they are not developing. They are pillaging the Global South. That's how it works. The type of states we have, they are modeled around the needs of the global system. So even if they call them democratic, they maintain this colonial imprint.
The solution to this is that the South needs to be able to pursue economic sovereignty. It needs to be able to reduce its dependence on foreign capital, on foreign creditors, and on imports from the Global North as much as possible. Organizing production around meeting domestic and national and regional needs rather than around servicing northern growthism.
I think that calls to decolonize the global economy are really central. I mean, here you have the poor countries of the world who are desperate for climate action because they are the most vulnerable to climate impacts, and they've done the least to create carbon pollution, and yet their power on the world stage is drastically limited because of that ongoing neocolonial structures.
It is deeply ironic that while consumerism is such a driving force in climate breakdown, there is an entire industry actively trying to persuade us that we can actually consume our way to a better world.
From now on, let's wear the waste.
The sheer deluge of quote-unquote eco-friendly, climate-conscious, sustainably sourced products around us raises the question, why does reducing our resource use require so much resource use?
the only agency that we have is basically to choose between different kinds of products that the system produces. Our sense of concern is short-circuited, right? We're sold some new green products and told that, look, everything can stay the same and we'll still be able to achieve our ecological goals. This is not true, but in the meantime, what it does is it absorbs our discontent that would otherwise be organized around producing a more just and sustainable society and asking real intellectual and systemic questions about the underlying economic model, right?
That said, there are really important reasons for consumers to consume differently. Number one is we actually have to do it. We've got to stop driving cars with internal combustion engines and, reducing meat consumption and reducing apparel consumption. The middle class and above consumers of the world do have to consume fewer carbon intensive goods, and we've got to consume different goods. But we have to do it as part of a social movement.
For several decades, a dominant environmental message has been about individual action.
You have the power to make a difference from the moment you wake up. Power your home with the sun. Refresh with a low-flow shower. Eat more leftovers and reuse a humble bag.
These things are undoubtedly positive changes, but when you set them up against a system that keeps using energy-intensive machines or churns out streams of single-use packaging or pushes fossil fuel guzzling vehicles, then individual action is exposed for the self-defeating endeavour that it can so often be. Treating systemic consumerism as if it was a personal responsibility rather than the result of entwined commercial and governmental interests is both wrong and mostly ineffectual.
It's really important to get the balance right in terms of the focus on collective action and individual action. And I think, in many countries, we've gone too far to the individual action side of things. That's where the corporations want us to be. And a person can have an outsized role, but that's only by changing other people. So what are the things that are going to empower you as an individual and enable you as an individual to get involved in that political action? That's the key.
Our ability to interact with our society as active political agents or citizens is severely curtailed within a system that requires us to play one central role, which is to be consumers. We need to have the political courage and the intellectual acumen and the personal creativity and sense of social innovation to be able to imagine ourselves beyond a capitalist growth model. Because it's extremely dangerous ecologically.
When you see people consuming fair trade products or ethical products, they want to do something, but they don't know how. That means that we have to free to liberate our political imagination. How could we reinvent political participation? It's only through struggles, through reflection, critical thinking, that we might come up with a progressive agenda.
Our current economic modus operandi is incredibly costly for the Earth, but growth remains the focus for economists and politicians the world over, and they're trying to convince themselves and us that we can have it all.
Green growth.
Green growth. Green growth. Green growth.
This discourse that we can maintain capitalist growth and somehow make it green is in fact not new. It's actually been around for about 50 years. It was first voiced and articulated by major economists in 1973. And of course, it's been half a century now. There's no evidence that it has made any substantive difference. Emissions are not going down. Resource use is still going up.
In 2009, South Korea decided to lead from the front in pursuit of green growth. It committed 2% of its GDP, around $38 billion, into environmental projects, hoping to create 1 million jobs over the following 5 years. The aim was to turbocharge growth in a slumping economy, while simultaneously encouraging a low-carbon society. South Korea's economy came back on track. However, emissions climbed, nearly 12% over 5 years. That's despite massive investments in clean energy, railway expansion, and energy efficiency.
If you need any clear single case study of evidence that demonstrates the fallacy of green growth claims, South Korea is a wonderful example here. And this is consistent with scientists' broader claims that green growth is not feasible to achieve. And the reason basically is that technological efficiency improvements and so on, the gains from those in a capitalist growth economy are reinvested to expand the process of production and consumption, right? And so there are some relative gains, but they end up resulting in absolute increases in resource and energy use.
Okay, there is a question that becomes quite hard to avoid when talking about the incredibly high cost the planet is paying for human consumption. And that is, well, how do we keep economies growing without people buying? There is a theory that says we're looking at this the wrong way. It's called degrowth, and Jason Hickel gets right at the core of what it's all about.
Basically, rich nations need to actively scale down less necessary forms of production. Okay, and that's what we refer to as degrowth, right? So instead of assuming that every sector of the economy should grow all the time, regardless of whether or not we actually need it to, let's have a conversation about what sectors we actually need to improve, things like healthcare access, public transportation, et cetera, and what sectors are clearly destructive and socially unnecessary and should be scaled down. So, SUV production, private car production, arms production, fast fashion, advertising, planned obsolescence, et cetera. There are huge sectors of our economy which are totally irrelevant to human well-being. And we can actively scale those down without any loss to our ability to satisfy core needs and achieve flourishing lives for all.
Knowing that, the kind of growth we have in the global north is highly dependent on exploitative conditions being imposed on the global south. And that means that degrowth could not only be a northern agenda, but a global agenda that has to take into account what is happening in the global south and the needs of the global south. And also that means that if there are adjustments to be made, those adjustments should come primarily in the global north, because those who overconsume, those who have, an unsustainable way of life are people in the global north.
The key matter here is we have to ask ourselves what the economy is for. And this is the very exciting part of this story, which is that we know it's possible to slow down excess production in rich nations, while at the same time improving social outcomes, simply, again, by reorganizing production around meeting human needs.
Okay, Jason, but I have to ask, what about jobs?
As your economy requires less labor to produce the things that are required to meet human needs, then you simply shorten the working week and share necessary labor more evenly, right? And so therefore you eliminate even the possibility of unemployment. You can maintain full employment even in a degrowth scenario. And you can use something like a public job guarantee or a climate job guarantee at the same time to bolster this strategy, to ensure that anyone who wants to can train up to contribute to and participate in the most important collective projects of our generation, rolling out renewable energy capacity, regenerating ecosystems, retrofitting houses for efficiency, et cetera.
Inequalities in consumption are stark. Globally, the 20% of the world's people in the highest income countries account for 86% of total private consumption expenditures. The poorest 20%, a minuscule 1.3%. Degrowth does not mean that developing countries should sacrifice improvements in living conditions. They must pursue economic growth to generate the resources necessary to invest heavily in healthcare and education. But growth in and of itself shouldn't be the imperative, and it cannot be infinite. The goal is to achieve well-being in balance with the Earth's systems.
If we do not reason within the framework of an egalitarian society, you could not address the challenges humanity is facing. Because at the same time that there is overconsumption in the global north, there is also underconsumption in most of the global south, because most people there are poor and they could not have access to basic goods and services. So they need somehow to consume more, not in the capitalist sense, but that to have access to a dignified life, that means having access to basic goods and services.
So there are countries where economic growth is important, but what I would say is that story has also been oversold in the South. The elites in these countries often sort of want to confine the poverty alleviation conversation to just growth because they benefit so much from growth. But the issue is sort of lifting people out of poverty, giving them decent living conditions.
We seem to be trapped in a kind of paradox, where for several decades there's been earnest talk and even some genuine concerted action to try and make progress on the question of climate change and ecological breakdown. And yet, frighteningly little sustained systemic change has been achieved during that time. And so we have to ask ourselves, what is responsible for this failure?
Until we are able to break free from these growth imperatives, then we're going to be in a situation where we could watch continued failure over the coming decades, even as climate breakdown worsens before our very eye. And so it's important that we understand that this failure to address the problem is not some kind of mistake. There's a structural reason for it. And until we start talking about the underlying economic system, then we're going to continue to make that fundamental error.
Thanks for watching episode 3 of All Hail the Planet, a series looking at the forces undermining meaningful action on climate change. We have 2 upcoming episodes still to go, one on plastic waste and one on urbanisation, which we'll be releasing in the weeks to come. So if you'd like to follow along, you can use the hashtag AllHailThePlanet. Otherwise, check out aljazeera.com.